Hello everybody. This video is just going to cover the very first PowerPoint in DC Bio for non-majors. This is going to be just kind of like an introduction, and I'm going to go ahead and make videos so that way you guys can have access to them on Google Classroom, and that way if you're absent or you missed the lesson, you can always go back and watch these videos if you'd like. I will tell you that my highlighting is not always great. Sometimes it does weird things, but hopefully these will be helpful to you if you need them. So like I mentioned, this is just going to be kind of an overview or kind of like a welcome to DC Bio in terms of the content that we're going to be covering this year. And so really, you're taking a biology class, so it's kind of important to understand what is biology. And hopefully you know from freshman year or even before that, that biology is the study of living things. And things that are living, or even things that were once living, we call biotic factors. And so that's going to be anything that is alive or was once alive. So even a dead tree would be considered biotic. Your abiotic are the non-living factors that we see in ecosystems, things like sunlight or oxygen gas or water. By themselves, they are not alive. Even though they may be important to living things, they themselves are not living and were never living. And so how do we determine if something's biotic or abiotic? Well, if you are a living thing, or if you're looking at a living thing or studying something that is an actual organism, there are certain characteristics that all living things share. And so there's really nothing for you to fill in here. This is just a list of the 8 characteristics that we're going to be going over the next several slides. And so one characteristic of life is that living things are made of cells, okay? They are either one cell or they are made up of many cells, but if it's not cellular, it would not be considered alive. And so one thing that often gets brought up of is it alive are viruses. And this is one characteristic that will keep viruses from being considered a biotic factor. They are not cellular. They do not have a cellular structure. And we're going to have a whole unit on cells where we talk about, the parts of a cell and the functions of cells. But essentially, there's going to be key features like a cell membrane. There's going to be genetic material inside. There's going to be cytoplasm. And the cell is the smallest unit of life. We're going to talk about organization, and the cell is going to be a part of that. But the cell is essentially where life begins. And so if the item or the object is not composed of cells, we would not consider it a living thing. And so the second characteristic of living things is that living things are organized. We have an organized structure that essentially goes from simpler to more complex. So it's kind of this hierarchy of levels, and not all of them are alive. Okay, over here you can see pretty much the whole organization. And so everything is made up of atoms. I'm sure you guys have had chemistry before. So atoms make up anything that has mass, or atoms make up matter. And so the atom by itself is not alive, but atoms are going to make up molecules, which make up macromolecules, and so forth. So life is organized. And so this is one of those things that as a teacher, I don't always encourage students to just memorize. I think it's very important for you to understand and actually be able to apply information. But for something like this, there's definitely a memorization component, and that you need to memorize this organization of life. So atoms form molecules. Molecules can be really, really large, and we call those macromolecules. In fact, we're going to have a whole unit or a whole lesson on these macromolecules. And these macromolecules are things like your DNA or a protein or a phospholipid that makes up your cell membrane. These macromolecules make up the organelles and parts of the cell, and then the cell is where life begins. So the cell is definitely made up of smaller components, but we do not get into the living portion until we get to the cell. And then we can continue this organization, and that cells form tissues. And so tissues are groups of cells that are working together with a similar function. So we actually have 4 different types of tissues, things like coverings, called epithelial tissues. We have muscle tissue for movement. We have nervous tissue for response, or we have connective tissues. And so cells make up tissues, and then these tissues make up our organs. And organs are not just a heart, okay? Even plants have organs, like a leaf is an organ. And then these organs work together to form organ systems, so like digestive system, muscular system, skeletal system. And then like in plants, there's also systems. There's your shoot system and your root system. And then the systems work together to form the whole organism. And so that would be your living thing. Now, if it were a unicellular organism, their organization is going to stop here. But when you have a multicellular organism, the cells will make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems, which make up the organism. And so this organization also continues beyond a single living thing or a single organism, and that we can have groups of organisms that make up a population. Populations living together make up a community. And then an ecosystem is going to be the communities plus the environment. So that's going to bring in those abiotic factors, things like soil and nutrients and light and water. And then the ecosystems that are similar form biomes. Some of your resources don't include biomes in this organization. I don't know why. But biomes, a lot of times you've probably studied them. They're things like the Arctic tundra or the rainforest. So they're ecosystems with similar conditions. And then all of the biomes make up the living earth, which is the biosphere. So this is one of those things that you may just want to memorize, okay? Life is organized from the atom, which is not living, all the way up to the cell, which is the beginning of life. And then cells are going to make up other levels, which ultimately end in the biosphere, which is the living earth. So this is a memorization thing. I don't have a mnemonic device or anything like that. You just need to know this order, okay? So for study purposes, because this is something that we're going to come back to all throughout the course. All right, another characteristic of living things is reproduction, because living things come from other living things. And so reproduction is going to be driven by our genetic material or our DNA. It's something that is going to involve copying genetic material and dividing into new cells. And so this reproduction can be either asexual or sexual. It doesn't necessarily mean having sex. It has to do with where does the information come from. And in asexual, there's only one parent. One parent is dividing to form new organisms, or one parent is budding to form new organisms. So essentially one parent cell is going to give rise to the offspring. And the key to asexual, or not the key, but one characteristic, sorry about the funky highlighter, I'm not sure why it does that, but the key to asexual is that your offspring are going to be identical. Just through reproduction alone, you're going to produce, like bacteria reproduce asexually, they're going to be making the same, okay? Now the key to sexual is that you have information coming from two parents. A lot of times this involves cells that we call gametes, like egg and sperm. They come together to form the offspring, and when it's sexual, you get genetically diverse offspring, okay? So in terms of evolution and natural selection, sexual is going to be superior because diversity is always going to be a good thing. So here's an example of sexual versus asexual. Here's the gametes that I mentioned. You've got your sperm and your egg. I'm not sure why it calls that female sperm. It's an egg. But you've got your egg and sperm. They come together to form the zygote, and then the zygote undergoes cell division to form the baby. And then asexual is just where you have one parent producing a new offspring with no genetic diversity. Okay, that could be binary fission, like what bacteria do. This could be budding, like what we see here. And there's multiple forms of each. Another characteristic of living things is that they grow and develop. And so most people are pretty familiar with growth. It just means getting bigger, like you've grown over time since you were an infant. You may be continuing to grow up through high school and maybe on into college. A lot of times this just involves increasing the number of cells that you have, like your bones are going to grow, you're going to get more skin, things like that. And then development are all those changes that take place. So like in that last picture where we saw the zygote, you clearly don't look like that zygote today. You aren't just one cell. You aren't just a ball of cells. You're actually a very specialized group of cells that form that organism. So especially in multicellular organisms, we have several stages that take place. So this is essentially everything that happens from that zygote all the way until death. And if you think about like human growth and development, we have different stages, like the infant stage, the toddler stage, pre-adolescence, teenage years, adulthood, old age, and our bodies and our organs and things inside of us are constantly developing over time. Another characteristic of life is that living things must take in materials from their surroundings, and they must use energy, okay? So it's not just food and oxygen, there's nutrients and vitamins and things like that, but essentially living things need stuff, okay? They're going to have to take in things from their surroundings. They're going to have to get energy from somewhere, because in order to keep that organization, that cell, tissue, organ system, organism, in order to maintain that, they're going to have energy. And we also need energy to carry out all of our general life functions, things like digestion, excretion. There's tons of them. And so we need energy to do work, and it takes work to maintain that organization. So here's just a couple examples. You're probably familiar with these reactions, but we have cellular respiration and photosynthesis. These are both examples of cells taking in materials and using them to either make energy or to create energy. So all organisms have to get food, and so there's two main ways that organisms can do that. If they are an autotroph, they make it themselves. Auto means self. Troph has to do with feeding, and so autotrophs are self-feeders, and this means that they can essentially produce their own food. Now, most autotrophs are probably going to be photosynthetic, which means they take in sunlight, but there is another process that's not as common, but some, like bacteria, can take chemicals from the earth and turn them into food. This is going to happen in places like maybe the bottom of caves or bottom of the ocean, where there is no light, but yet there's still life. And then everything else is going to be considered a heterotroph. And this is where they're going to be, hetero means different. These are different feeders. So they're going to have to feed off other living things. They can either be consumers, where they are physically eating or consuming a living thing or a dead living thing, or they could be decomposers. And this is where they still get their nutrients from something else. They just release enzymes and break it down and then absorb it. But if you cannot make it yourself, you're going to be considered a heterotroph. Another characteristic of life is that living things respond to stimuli. So in the mornings, it may be dark in your bedroom, and as soon as you turn the light on, your pupils are going to get smaller. And as soon as you walk into a dark room, your pupils are going to get bigger. If somebody were to hit you, you might say, ow. If you get hot, you may start sweating. When we eat, our glucose is going to go up, and when our glucose goes up, we release insulin from our pancreas. If we get scared, our heart rate increases. So we are constantly responding to stimuli around us, and even your simple organisms, even things like bacteria, can move toward or away from light, or move toward chemicals or away from chemicals. So in general, living things are going to respond. Another very important characteristic is homeostasis maintenance, okay? And this word, homeo, means the same. Stasis means to stay, or the state of being constant. And so this word literally means staying the same. And so even though the outside around us is constantly changing, the inside of our cells and the inside of our bodies is staying relatively constant. We're keeping a constant temperature. And this is why we do things like sweating or shivering. We maintain a relatively constant blood glucose level, and this is why we release insulin or glucagon. We keep a steady heart rate. We keep a steady blood pressure. We need to maintain water balance. And even though the surroundings are constantly changing, we have these built-in mechanisms. Most of them are what we call negative feedback, but they help us maintain this relatively constant state. We kind of have a small window of change, and if we go outside of that change, that's essentially when we are sick, or when we have a disease, or it could potentially ultimately lead to death. And so this is what our organ systems do. They are what we call interdependent, but those organ systems work together to help us maintain those constant internal conditions. And so here's an example of kind of the way negative feedback works. We kind of have three components. So we sense changes. We have a control center, which is often our brain, and our brain's going to kind of determine, is this normal or not normal? If it's not normal, it's going to send a message to an effector to do something. So that could be, hey, sweat glands, release sweat. Or that could be, hey, pancreas, release insulin. And so what'll happen is we turn something on in order to try to get back to that balance. And then once we get back to that balance, we turn it off. This is something we call negative feedback. And so our body is kind of constantly doing a checks and balances to make sure we are where we need to be. And so some examples of some things that we maintain homeostasis in is like oxygen, body temp, blood pressure. And these are all examples of negative feedback in our body where we're constantly checking and turning on and turning off different mechanisms. The last characteristic of living things is that living things adapt. And so we know that the environment around us is not constant. There could be changes. They could be small. They could be large. They could be catastrophic. But no matter what, when we're looking at populations, remember that populations are groups of the same organism. Within a population, we tend to have diversity. We have variety. We have variation. And so not all are going to be created equal. And so there's going to be different traits or slight variations of traits. And so certain organisms within that population may have traits that make them better suited. So like the giraffes with the longer necks can eat more. The bears with the thicker coat and fat are going to survive better in a cold environment. And so those that are better suited are going to be well adapted. And what that does is being better suited means that those particular organisms are going to live longer and reproduce more, okay? And so natural selection is going to be the mechanism that ultimately leads to these adaptations. Now, I don't want you to confuse these two terms. We have natural selection and we have evolution, all right? So natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. Natural selection is essentially survival of the fittest. This is where those that have those advantages survive longer, they reproduce more, and what will happen is that over time, we see those particular traits increasing over the generations. Now, as we see changes to the genetic makeup of that population, evolution is occurring, okay? So the changes over time is evolution. One mechanism that can lead to that change is natural selection. And so living things are constantly adapting to their environment as in terms of a population, okay? Single organisms cannot evolve, but the populations evolve to become better adapted. And so here's an example. These are some things that contribute to natural selection. So things like variation are essential, and some organisms are going to be better suited. Death is going to be a part of natural selection. And then those that are better suited will most likely increase in the population, and that's what produces those adaptations. All right, the last little bit that we're going to cover in our notes is classification of life. And living things are very diverse. If you think about all of the living things on this planet, we don't even know what they are, but they range from unicellular bacteria to protists like amoebas, to fungi like mushrooms and yeast, to plants, to animals. We have all different types of organisms on this planet, and so we need some way to classify them. Now, there's a big branch of science known as systematics. A lot of this involves studying things like DNA sequences and looking for similarities among organisms. And so this is how we classify our organisms that we have on planet Earth. And so our organization is a hierarchy. Once again, kind of like the organization of life, we have different levels. And in this case, we have a large level called a domain, which includes many, many, many organisms, all the way down to an individual type of organism. So we have this hierarchy from domain all the way down to species. And kind of like the organization of life, this is something that you may just want to memorize, okay? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so the way it works is we have 3 domains. So all of life is going to fit either under archaea, bacteria, or eukarya. And archaea are these weirdo prokaryotes. So just a quick reminder that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus and eukaryotes do. So prokaryotes that live in extreme environments, they can handle very salty, very hot, very acidic. They're going to live in places that a lot of other things would not thrive. They're going to live in places with no oxygen. So they're just going to be your what we call extremophile prokaryotes. Your bacteria are your more common everyday prokaryotes. We're pretty familiar with these. Some are good, some are bad, some are beneficial, some cause disease. It just depends on what kind they are. But things like E. coli, strep, staph, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, there's all different types. And then we have eukarya, and like the name implies, these are going to be eukaryotes, and these are organisms that do have a nucleus. And that's going to include everything else. So your protists, fungi, plants, and animals. Now, depending on what resource you're looking at, your systematics and taxonomy is a field of science that is constantly changing and constantly being revised. And so sometimes the names have changed. So depending on the resources that you're looking at, your classification does change over time as we learn more. But essentially right now we have these 3 domains. Now, under these 3 domains, and this is where it's a little iffy, okay? I think for the most part, we're still kind of under a 6-kingdom system, but really it's still up for investigation, okay? So all of your prokaryotes were put into these categories. So domain archaea is kingdom archaea, and domain bacteria is kingdom bacteria. They could be split into more detailed kingdoms in the future, but for now it's just 1 domain and 1 kingdom. Protista is really currently being divided, but I think there's debate of exactly how to divide them. But there's some very distinct characteristics among protists. The only thing that they all have in common is that they're eukaryotes. Other than that, there's going to be exceptions to the rule. And then you've got your fungi, which are typically your decomposers like mushrooms. You have your plants and your animals. Okay, so the 3 domains are, for now, we're going to learn that they are split into 6 kingdoms. And so there's your basic kind of, this is what's called a phylogenetic tree. You can kind of see where they branch and what came from what. And then we have the rest of our taxonomy, or the rest of our classification. So we have the biggest domain. The domain is divided into kingdoms, which are then divided into phyla. This is a phylum, is singular, phyla is plural. A phylum is divided into many classes. A class is divided into many orders. An order is divided into many genera, and the singular term for this is genus. Okay, so genera is plural, genus is singular. And then a single genus can be broken down into more than 1 species. So we go all the way from a domain down to an individual species. And so a species is essentially a group of the same organisms. Technically, they have to be able to breed and produce offspring. And you cannot get more alike than the same species. These are going to be the most common in their genetic material, in their body plan. And then if we look at the kind of the system, so everything is here. We have 3 domains. We have 6 kingdoms. Those kingdoms are made up of phyla. And so what we're doing is we're getting more and more specific. So the lower the group that you share, as you go down this hierarchy, the closer you get to species, the more related you are. So 2 organisms in the same family are going to have more in common than just 2 organisms in the same class. Like, we are in the same kingdom as an earthworm. I would not say that we are super related to them. We are in the same order as all primates. So we would have more in common with other primates than we would, say, just the earthworm where we shared the kingdom, okay? So the lower the level, the more related they are. And the last little bit to cover is scientific naming. So you've probably heard of taxonomy before. You've definitely probably heard of that over systematics, but taxonomy is within the branch of systematics. And this is where we kind of put organisms into those groups and give them a scientific name. Cat is not a cat in every language, and so we need a universal language where no matter where you are on planet Earth, we are calling that organism the same thing. And so this is where we get the scientific naming concept. Now, it's actually what we call binomial nomenclature. It is a 2-name naming system. And the two parts are the two lowest levels in your hierarchy. You have the genus and the species, okay? Now, the way we write that scientific name is like this. The genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase, and it should be in italics. So anytime you see that format, what you're seeing is the scientific name. And I know this picture is a little bit blurry. I did try to find a better one, but I was having trouble finding a good list of scientific names. So here's some common animals, like Canis familiaris. They have an extra name in there. We are Homo sapiens. The cobra is Naha Naha. So you can see that there's the same format every time. We have capital genus, lowercase species in italics. Here's some for different plants, like the pea, Pisum sativum. The peas were studied by Gregor Mendel. You can see like the maize or corn, there you can see those names. They are in Latin, which is why you have those funky sounding words. They kind of have Latin prefixes and suffixes. And so sometimes they're named for where they're found, sometimes they're named for characteristics. It just depends. Whoever discovers them typically gets to name them. And so that is going to wrap up our very first lesson. Hopefully this is going to be helpful to you. And pretty much as we move through the year, we're going to go into each and every one of these things in more detail. Okay, so this is just kind of an overview. You will be having a quiz over your first few sets of notes, and this is going to be one of them. So be sure you keep those notes handy. You can always come back and reference the PowerPoint again. And I hope you guys have a great day and a good start to dual credit biology. Hopefully I will see you guys soon.